Welcome to the Science of Hockey, the podcast where we break down the science behind ice hockey. I'm the analyst, your host, and every week we explore the data, research, and evidence that shape how we play, train, and understand the game of hockey. From biomechanics to performance psychology, we take you beyond the rink and into the research lab, giving you insights that go beyond hearsay and into what really makes the difference on the ice. Whether you're a player, a coach, a parent, or just someone passionate about the sport, we're here to bring you scientifically backed information in a language that's friendly and easy to understand. So grab your skates and let's dive into the science of hockey. Welcome back to the Science of Hockey. I'm your host, the analyst, and today we're heading to the emergency room for a closer look at hockey injuries. This episode is based on the study Injury Patterns of Non-Fatal Accidents Related to Ice Hockey, which analyzes 7 years of emergency admissions in Switzerland. We'll explore the most common injuries, fractures, lacerations, and concussions, and their causes from player collisions to puck impacts. Whether you're a recreational skater or a professional player, understanding these patterns could be key to staying safe on the ice. Join us as we discuss what this research means for injury prevention, protective gear, and game rules. It's a vital conversation about protecting players while preserving the spirit of the sport. Grab your helmets and let's dive in.
All right, everybody, get ready because today we're going deep into hockey.
Deep.
But we're not focusing on the goals or the big hits or any of that stuff.
Right.
We're talking about the injuries.
The injuries, yeah. And what's so interesting about this deep dive is that we're looking at like 7 years of data.
Wow.
From an emergency room in Switzerland.
Okay.
So we're seeing real world injuries, not just, kind of theoretical.
And this isn't just pros, right? This is...
No, this is everybody.
Okay, so what are we trying to figure out here? I know you sent me this research. It's pretty intense.
Yeah.
So what's our mission?
I think our mission is to kind of uncover the most common ways that people are getting injured playing hockey.
Okay.
Are there any surprises in this data? And what does it mean for, for prevention, for making the sport safer for everybody?
All right, well, let's start breaking this down.
Okay.
First of all, who's getting hurt? Demographics, right?
Yeah, well, they looked at patients 16 and over, and like you might expect, it's mostly men. And the biggest group is between 16 and 25, which makes sense. That's prime hockey playing years.
That's when you're invincible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's a really important detail.
Okay.
Most of these patients were not professional players.
Okay.
So this has big implications for recreational leagues and how they're approaching safety.
So this is your beer leagues.
Yeah, exactly. Your beer leaguers, your weekend warriors.
Yeah, so it's not just the NHL stars. It's everybody who's playing hockey.
Exactly.
Okay, so then when I think of hockey injuries, I'm thinking the big hits, the fights,
yes.
Really dramatic stuff.
Yeah, the highlight reel.
But this research, what are the most common injuries?
So actually, the most common injuries weren't the super flashy ones.
Okay.
We're talking about fractures, contusions, which are basically really bad bruises, and then lacerations, which are cuts.
Makes sense with all the sticks and skates.
Exactly. There's a lot of shark stuff flying around out there.
So those are the kind of the bread and butter, the ones that happen all the time.
Be everyday injuries, yeah.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about concussions.
Okay. Yeah, those are scary.
They're serious.
Yeah.
They weren't the most common injury in this data set.
Okay.
But they still showed up in over 10% of the cases.
That's a lot.
That's significant, especially when you think about the long-term impact of repeated head injuries.
Yeah, we'll come back to concussions because I definitely want to talk more about that.
Absolutely.
But first, I gotta say, this one surprised me.
What's that?
So the study said the most common type of injury, no matter how old you were, was facial injuries.
Interesting.
I would have thought, with the helmets and all that.
Yeah, you would think so.
That wouldn't be the case, but...
Apparently not.
Yeah, and it's even crazier because they cited another piece of research where they found that every single facial injury they looked at was someone not wearing facial protection.
That's a pretty good argument for wearing face protection.
Yeah.
At all levels of play, not just the pros.
That's crazy.
It makes you wonder why anyone would risk it.
So we know what injuries are happening, but what's causing them?
The biggest culprit is player-on-player contact.
Okay.
That was over 37% of the injuries.
Wow.
And then after that, puck contact, and then falls.
And when they say player-to-player contact, is that everything?
They get into specifics, yeah.
Okay.
They highlight boarding as a major issue.
For those who don't know, that's when you get, like, slammed into the boards, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's when a player gets checked violently into the boards surrounding the rink.
Yeah, and they said that was responsible for, like, a quarter of all those player-to-player injuries.
Over 25%, yep.
And those were causing concussions too, right?
They were a major factor in concussions, yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. This is what I thought was really fascinating. They broke down some of the causes by age. So you'd think younger players would be more likely to get hurt from aggressive plays.
Yeah, I mean, less experience, I guess.
Maybe. But actually, this research found that older players were more prone to injuries from falls.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
You think they'd be, like, better at avoiding that kind of stuff?
You'd think. But the study suggests it might have to do with things like reduced reaction time as players age.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe a little less flexibility, even just changes in their balance.
So as we age, we gotta, like, think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a reminder that age plays a role in how we approach training and preventing injuries.
Yeah.
What works for a 20-year-old might not be the best approach for a 40-year-old.
For sure.
And vice versa.
All right, so we talked about the older guys taking tumbles, but what about those younger players? Any trends there?
Well, if we go back to player contact, remember that was the #1 cause of injuries overall.
Yeah.
That was especially true for the 16 to 25-year-olds.
Right.
Yeah, they had a highest rate of injuries from contact with other players.
I guess that kind of makes sense, right? Maybe they're more likely to be involved in those aggressive plays, you know, the boarding and all that.
It's definitely possible.
Like maybe less experience or a different culture in their leagues.
Yeah, and the study doesn't get into why this is happening more in that age group.
Oh.
But it does raise some questions.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, is it coaching styles, the culture of the sport at different levels?
Maybe just, like, young and dumb?
Could be.
Yeah.
You know, youthful enthusiasm.
All right, so we've talked about younger players, older players, but what about professional athletes? How do they compare to, like, the amateurs?
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So you would think professional athletes would have more injuries overall.
Right.
Because they're playing at such a high intensity.
It just seems more dangerous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the study actually found that there wasn't a significant difference in the overall number of injuries.
Wow, really?
Between professionals and amateurs.
That's a surprise.
But here's the catch.
Okay.
While the number of injuries was similar, the pros were significantly more likely to require surgery.
Oh, so it's like...
It's not that they're getting hurt more often, it's that the injuries are more severe.
So are they, like, pushing themselves so hard that they're, like, damaging their bodies more?
Maybe. Or is there more pressure to play through pain?
And then maybe that makes things worse.
Could be. It's hard to say for sure from this data.
Yeah.
It's also possible that the medical management of pro athletes is just different.
Okay.
You know, maybe they're more likely to opt for surgery.
You get them back on the ice quicker.
Exactly.
But that's interesting. So even though we're seeing a lot of these injuries happening in, like, amateur leagues,
right,
the severity might be higher for the pros.
It's a possibility. And it reminds us that we need to think about prevention and safety at every level.
Yeah, from, like, youth leagues all the way up.
All the way up.
So concussions, you mentioned those before.
Yeah.
What did the research say about those specifically?
Remember how he said concussions showed up in over 10% of cases?
Yeah, it was a lot.
The study emphasizes that, you know, even though they're not as frequent as some of the other injuries,
right,
there's still a big concern because of the potential long-term effects.
Yeah, even seemingly minor concussions can really add up over time.
Absolutely.
Lead to bigger problems.
And they highlight the importance of recognizing and managing concussions properly.
Yeah.
They talk about how multiple concussions can lead to some serious long-term issues.
Okay.
Like migraines, mental health problems, and even something called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE.
CTE, I've heard of that. That's the degenerative brain disease, right?
Exactly. It's linked to repeated head trauma.
Yeah, it's really scary stuff.
It's a serious issue.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the need to take even those, you know, seemingly minor concussions very seriously.
Not just tough it out.
We need to shift away from that tough it out mentality.
For sure.
And really prioritize brain health in hockey.
Right. So we've talked about what kind of injuries are happening, what's causing them.
Yeah.
The differences between age groups and pros versus amateurs.
We've covered a lot of ground.
It's been fascinating so far.
It has.
But this research definitely has some big implications for how we approach safety in hockey.
It does.
Now that we understand these injury patterns better,
right,
hopefully that'll help us figure out how to prevent them.
Exactly.
So I guess that's what we'll dive into next, right?
Yeah, that's where we're headed next.
All right, you ready to keep going?
Let's do it. All right, let's keep digging into this research.
Okay.
One thing that really stood out to me was how they break down the injuries by age.
Okay.
It's not just about the overall numbers, but how the types of injuries and what causes them actually change as players get older.
Right, because our bodies definitely change as we age. And I would think that, probably has an impact on how we play, what injuries we're more susceptible to.
For sure. So they actually, they divided the players up into these 4 age groups, starting with 16 to 25, then 26 to 35, 36 to 45, and then 46 and up.
Okay. And so were the older players just getting more injuries because they're older?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
Remember we talked about falls being more common in that 36 and up group.
Yeah.
That trend continues.
Okay.
They were significantly more likely to be injured by falls compared to, the younger groups.
So it's not just years of wear and tear. I guess it's something about how they're moving or maybe their reaction time.
Could be.
It's making them more susceptible to falls?
Yeah, the researcher suggested it could be related to things like decreased reaction time.
Okay.
Maybe less flexibility, even just those subtle changes in balance that we all experience as we get older.
That makes sense.
It's a good reminder that age should really be a factor in how we approach, training and injury prevention. What works for a 20-year-old might not be the best for a 40-year-old.
For sure.
And vice versa.
All right. So falls are a bigger deal for those seasoned veterans, but what about the younger players? Any patterns there?
Well, if we go back to those causes of injuries, player-to-player contact was the number one, right?
Right.
That was especially true for the 16 to 25-year-olds.
Really?
Yeah, they had the highest rate of injuries from contact with other players.
Huh. I wonder if those high-impact collisions, if that's affecting them differently too.
It's a good question, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with boarding.
Yeah.
Maybe younger players are more likely to be involved in those really aggressive plays.
Yeah.
Whether it's due to inexperience.
Or maybe just the style of play that's encouraged in their leagues.
It's a possibility. And while this study didn't, dive into the specifics of why, it does raise some questions like, is it coaching styles? Is it the culture of the sport at different levels?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are the younger players getting the right guidance, the right training?
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So we've covered younger players, older players, but what about professional athletes? How do they compare to the amateurs?
Oh, this is where the data gets really fascinating.
Okay.
So you'd think pro athletes would have more injuries overall.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're playing at such a high intensity.
It just seems like it'd be way more dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, here's the surprising part.
Okay.
The study found there wasn't a significant difference in the overall number of injuries.
Wow. Really?
Between pros and amateurs.
That's surprising.
But here's the catch.
Okay.
While the number was similar,
the
pros were significantly more likely to require surgery.
So it's they're not necessarily getting hurt more often, but when they do get hurt, it's worse.
Exactly. It's not that they're getting hurt more. It's that the injuries are more severe.
So what's going on there? Are they pushing their bodies so hard that they're doing more damage?
Maybe. Or is there more pressure to play through the pain?
Which could make it worse.
Exactly.
It's hard to say.
It's also possible the medical management for pro athletes is just different,
Oh, yeah. They're probably more likely to just go straight to surgery.
Get them back on the ice quicker.
Yeah, makes sense.
But it is interesting that, even though a lot of these injuries are happening in those amateur leagues, the severity might actually be higher for the pros.
It's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, it reminds us we need to be thinking about prevention and safety at all levels of play.
From youth leagues to the pros.
All the way up.
All right. Well, speaking of prevention, let's take a look at some of the specific types of injuries that they were seeing in this data.
Okay.
Now, remember, this is research done at an emergency room, so it's focused on those acute injuries, the stuff that sends you to the ER right after it happens on the ice.
Right, the immediate aftermath.
So we're getting a snapshot of, the immediate consequences, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about those long-term effects.
Exactly.
Okay, well, so one of the most common injury types were fractures, so broken bones.
Right. Makes sense.
Which isn't surprising when you consider all the hard surfaces and fast movements and collisions.
Yeah.
And they found that fractures were most often in the upper limbs.
So arms, wrists, shoulders, that kind of thing. And then after that, it was fractures to the head and face.
And I'm guessing a lot of those facial fractures probably involve, like, the jaw, the cheekbones, given how much contact there is to the face.
You're right. And remember those facial injuries we were talking about earlier, how they were the most common injury overall?
Yeah.
The researchers pointed out that in another study they cited, all of the facial injuries happened to players who weren't wearing any kind of facial protection.
That should be on a poster in every locker room.
It really should.
So we got fractures. What other types of injuries were they seeing a lot of?
Well, they also saw a lot of contusions, which are basically just really bad bruises.
Okay.
Those are most common in the back, neck, and throat area.
Yeah, that makes sense with all the checking and the collisions.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you got lacerations.
The cuts.
The cuts.
Yeah.
And they said those were mostly on the face.
Probably from high sticks or pucks.
Yeah, those can be pretty nasty, especially when they're on the face.
Absolutely.
And then they were also seeing sprains and strains.
Right, and those were often in the shoulders and knees.
Okay.
It's actually pretty interesting how, the distribution of these injuries kind of aligns with the biomechanics of the sport.
Yeah.
The way players move, the forces that are involved.
Makes sense that certain parts of the body are just more vulnerable.
Exactly.
But we can't forget about concussions.
Right. We got to talk about those.
So what specifically did they find out about concussions?
Remember, concussions were present in over 10% of the cases.
Yeah.
And they were mostly caused by player-to-player contact. The study really emphasized that even though concussions might not be as frequent as those other types of injuries,
right,
there's still a major concern because of those potential long-term consequences.
Because multiple concussions can lead to some serious health issues down the road.
Exactly. And they talked about how important it is to properly diagnose and manage concussions.
Okay.
They mentioned migraines, mental health problems, even CTE.
Right. It's really serious stuff.
It is.
We got to, move away from that tough it out mentality.
We really do. We got to prioritize brain health in hockey.
So that means proper diagnosis.
Absolutely. And making sure players have enough time to recover.
Yeah, you can't rush back from a concussion.
Absolutely not.
All right. Well, this has given us a lot to think about in terms of preventing these injuries.
For sure.
Protecting players, both in the short term and the long term. But I'm also really curious about those long-term consequences.
Yeah.
This study was focused on those immediate injuries.
Yeah.
What about the impact those have? Weeks, months, even years down the line?
That's a great question and a perfect transition into the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're going to explore those long-term implications.
I'm going deep.
Okay, so we've talked about what kind of injuries hockey players are getting, what causes them, and how it's different between the age groups, the pros versus amateurs.
We've covered a lot.
But I'm really curious about those long-term consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, this research, focused on those immediate injuries, the stuff that sends you to the ER.
Right.
But what about, the impact weeks, months, even years later?
That's a really important part of the conversation.
Yeah, because even what seems like a minor injury could have a big impact down the road.
Exactly. And think about those concussions.
Yeah.
Even if they don't cause those immediate, dramatic symptoms, repeated concussions can really contribute to things like cognitive decline, mood disorders, even CTE later in life.
It's almost like a ticking time bomb in some cases.
In a way, yeah.
And it's not just concussions, right? Chronic pain from joint injuries, lingering weakness from muscle strains.
Absolutely.
Those can really affect your life, long after you've stopped playing.
For sure. So this research is great, but it really shows we need more studies that look at the long-term impacts of hockey injuries.
Follow athletes over time.
Yeah. Get the bigger picture.
So what can players, coaches, parents, what should they be thinking about to try and reduce those risks?
I think it starts with emphasizing proper technique and safety right from the beginning.
Teaching young players how to check safely, how to follow those fundamentals.
The habits early on.
And then equipment.
Oh, yeah.
You talked about facial protection.
Helmets that fit properly, good padding.
It's like a suit of armor, but one that actually protects you.
I like that analogy.
And then concussions. Got to talk about those.
Absolutely. Educate players, coaches, parents about the signs and symptoms, making sure they're reported.
Yep.
Proper medical evaluation following those return-to-play protocols.
Gotta get rid of that tough it out mentality.
It's just not worth it.
Not when it comes to your brain.
Right.
And hockey is a tough sport.
It is.
So strength training, flexibility, overall conditioning.
All of that can help reduce the risk of injuries.
Yeah, it's an investment in their long-term health.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today.
We have.
It's been fascinating, but also a little bit, sobering.
It is, but it's important to have these conversations.
Yeah.
So we can make informed decisions.
Right.
Make hockey safer for everyone.
And as always, we encourage you listeners to keep learning.
Yeah.
Ask questions.
Do your own research.
Advocate for safety in your hockey communities.
Because at the end of the day, it's about protecting the players and making sure the joy of the game can last a lifetime.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time, stay safe out there.
Thanks for tuning in to the Science of Hockey. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it with your friends, teammates, or anyone who loves hockey as much as you do. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment to let us know what you liked, what you'd like to hear next, or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us make the show even better. Until next time, keep your skates sharp, your mind open, and keep chasing the science behind the game.